So this is video 9 for chapter 3, and in this video we're going to talk about identifying independent and dependent variables in a story problem or a situation. So this doesn't really go with your book. It doesn't have a section in the book. It's kind of something that you probably talked a little bit about in 6th grade, but we're going to build on it here. So here's your vocab. Quantity is the first one in your list. A quantity is something that you can count or measure. It can have any different units, but it's something that you can count or measure. Okay, and along with that, we're also going to talk about variables. So a variable is a quantity that can change. Okay, so we use letters to represent variables in a story problem, but those variables are still something that you can count or measure. And when we say that a variable can change, something like 4 is not a variable because it can't change. It's just 4. But your age can change, or the height of a tree can change, or how much gas in your gas tank can change, or the time can change. Those are all quantities that you can count or measure that can change over time. So we're going to be looking a lot at the relationship between two variables. When two variables are related somehow, when one of them depends on the other and they're connected in some way, then we say that there's a relationship between them. So we're going to focus on the relationship between a dependent and an independent variable a lot in this video. So we're going to be looking at expressions as well. We've used these all throughout the year. Expressions are when you write something using numbers, letters, or symbols. No equal sign, no words, just numbers, letters, and symbols. So we've seen that all through chapter 3, where we can take story problems and turn them into expressions. But now we're also going to be doing a little bit more with equations. So when you take an expression and you set it equal to another expression with an equal sign in between, that gives you an equation. Okay, so when you have numbers, letters, and symbols equal to other numbers, letters, and symbols, that's called an equation. Okay, so a lot of our equations in this chapter will start with y equals 8 minus 3x, or y equals 2x plus 4. Those are what a lot of our equations will look like, but we'll see all different types. Just important to know the difference between an expression and an equation. Okay, so you have a spot on your paper where it says independent variable. Kind of put all of this down. This is all important to know about the independent variable. In the parentheses, independent variable is always the x. X is the independent variable. So we think of in a story problem, the independent variable is going to be the input. It's what you can control or what's in control. It's the thing that determines what happens. And, put a star by this one, the independent variable oftentimes is time. So an example would be minutes or hours or days or years. If that's in your story problem, that's probably the independent variable. Okay, so we'll go over lots of examples, but have this written down on your paper. And then the dependent variable, so put in the parentheses y. Y is always the dependent variable. And that in your story problem is going to be the outcome or the output or the result or the effect. You can't control it, it's just the thing that happens. Okay? It's what happens as a result of the independent variable. So it's the thing that depends on the other variable. So we're talking about the relationship between two variables. X is the kind of the thing in control or the thing you can control in the situation. Y is the thing that's just the outcome or the result of that happening. Okay, so on your paper you'll see a little graph. Label that where you see the question marks. You don't have question marks on yours, but we need to label it. So this is always going to be your x variable down here on the bottom, the horizontal line. This is the x-axis on a graph. This is where we put the y variable up the side. And this line is the y-axis. So anytime you're labeling a graph, you're going to need these 4 labels, an x and a y, and then whatever the x variable is, label goes here. Whatever the y variable is, the label would go there. Okay, so it's important to have that all on your paper, but let's look at some examples to actually figure out what that means. So here's the big idea. Write this in the box. Y depends on x. Whatever the y variable is, it depends on whatever the x variable is. Okay? Or you could say the x variable determines as in controls, it's in charge, what happens to the y variable. Okay? So, I always think of it as y is the result or the outcome, x is the one in control. Or x is the one in control, y is the result or the outcome. Okay, so let's do some examples. Here's an example. You probably recognize this guy from a Disney movie. That's Pinocchio. And if you remember the story of Pinocchio, every time he told a lie, his nose grew a little bit longer. So is there a relationship between the length of a person's nose and the number of lies they tell? Yeah, for Pinocchio, there was. They were related somehow. Okay. In this example, what depends on what? Well, first let's go back and figure out what our two variables are. The two things that we can count or measure in this situation are the length of the person's nose and the number of lies that they tell. You can count or measure this, you can count or measure this. Those are the two variables, and they're related for Pinocchio, right? The more lies he told, the longer his nose grew. So what depends on what? Well, the nose length depends on how many lies, number of lies that he tells. Okay, so that means we can determine which is the independent and which is the dependent. The thing in control, the independent variable, is the number of lies he tells. The dependent variable, y, is the result, so that's how long his nose is. Okay, so if I was going to label these, I would say the length of a person's nose would be the result, the y variable, that depends on x, the independent variable, how many lies they tell. So there's a place to write that on your paper. Let's do a couple more examples. We'll do these ones together, the first 5. Which is the x and which is the y variable? So vocabulary and time spent reading. Remember, think of it this way. X is the thing in control, y is the result or the outcome. So vocabulary, how many words you know, would be the result of how much time you spend reading. This is the thing you can control. Okay, hours work and paycheck. Well, you can control your paycheck, so that has to be x. The result is how much money you get paid, or the outcome is your paycheck, y. Number of late assignments and your grade. Well, you control the number of late assignments. The result or the outcome would be the grade that you get. Detentions, behavior in class. Which one can you control? Well, you can control your behavior in class. The result or the outcome of that is going to be how many detentions you get. Right? So detentions, the number of detentions depends on your behavior in class. Y depends on x. Happiness and attitude. This one, kind of a bad example because some people could say either way. If you say you choose your attitude, the thing that you're in control of would be your attitude, and the result would be how happy you are. Okay, maybe you don't agree with that, but we'll go with that example. Okay, so your happiness in this case would depend on your attitude. So that was 1 through 5. Here's 6 through 12. Okay, I'm giving you 2 variables. In each case, there's 2 variables. You determine which is x and which is y. If it helps, write this down. X is the thing in control, or the thing you can control, and y is the result or the outcome. The more you say this, the easier it will be to remember. So go ahead and decide in each of these cases which is the x and which is the y, and then we'll come back and check. So pause, write down x and y for each one, and then check. Okay, so let's go through these. The weight lost and hours exercised. Well, this is the part I can control. How much weight I lose would be the result or the outcome of that. So weight loss depends on hours exercised. Car speed and braking distance. I can control my car speed. The result or the outcome of that is going to be how long it takes me to stop. Braking distance depends on how fast you're driving. Number of chores done, how happy your parents are. You control how many chores you do. The result is how happy your parents will be. How happy your parents are depends on how many chores you get done. Hours passed, total rain fallen. How long it's been is in control of the situation. How much rain you get overall would be the result or the outcome. How much rain depends on how long it's been raining. Person's height and hair color. This one's a trick question. There is no relationship between a person's height and their hair color. So if there's not a relationship, we can't determine which is X and which is Y. Calories eaten and weight gained. So you control how many calories you eat. The result or the outcome is going to be how many calories you gain. Or how much weight you gain. So weight gain is the result, or it's determined by how many calories you eat. And then general health and vegetables eaten. You control how many vegetables you eat. General health would be the overall result or the outcome of that. So general health depends on how many vegetables you eat. So we're going to be looking at a lot of different story problems, and you need to determine kind of which is the X and which is the Y, which is the independent or dependent variables. So here's, there's kind of room on your paper to write this down. The hint, big hint, time. Weeks, years, days, minutes, seconds, anything that has to do with time is usually the X variable, is usually the independent variable. Okay, just a hint. So if there's something to do with time, that's probably X. And then really important too, write this down. Whatever space you have on your paper, there's a little bit of room to write this down. Variables are, remember that variables are always something you can count or measure. Variables are never a number. So when we get into the next set of examples, keep that in mind. You're looking for the things that you can count or measure, and they're not going to have a number. So let's do this one together. It says decide what the X and the Y variables are in each example. Itchy the cat started out with 50 fleas and is gaining 10 a week. Okay, so I'm going to be looking for the two things that I can count or measure, and maybe you want to underline them. I can count or measure how many fleas, and I can count or measure how many weeks. Okay, the variable is not going to be a number and not a number. So I'm counting fleas and I'm counting weeks. And then I just have to determine which is X and which is Y. Well, I can go ahead and write this down. Y always depends on X. So for all of these, Y depends on X, Y depends on X. That's going to be the same every time. Well, we can tell from Itchy the cat, the number of fleas is going to depend on how many weeks it's been. Number of weeks. Right? As more weeks go by, he gets more fleas. So kind of the number of weeks is in control of how many fleas he's gonna have. So I want you to try the next ones. My numbering is off, but try 2, 3, 4, 5 on your paper and determine what the variables are, and then which is X and which is Y, and kind of fill in the blanks on your paper. And then we'll come back and check. Okay, we already did the first one. Properly fitting shoe is always 2.5 centimeters longer than the person's foot. So the two things I'm counting and measuring are shoe size and foot size. And the shoe depends on your foot, and Y always depends on X. Mr. Snicket has $2,000 in savings, but he's losing $75 a month at the horse races. Remember, my variables are never going to be the numbers. The things I'm counting or measuring here are how much he has in savings and how many months he's been going to the horse races. And Y always depends on X. How much money he has depends on how many months he's been spending at the horse races. This one, outside temperature, a snake's temperature is always 5 degrees lower. Well, the snake's temperature is going to depend on the outside temperature. Those are the two things I'm counting or measuring. Remember, it's never a number. And Y always depends on X. The snake depends on how cold it is outside. Colonel Mustard burps 5 times for every pizza slice that he eats. Well, I'm counting burps and I'm counting slices of pizza. Not a number. Okay? And the number of burps is going to depend on the number of slices. Or another way you could say that is the number of slices is going to determine how many burps he has. But when we say it this way, Y always depends on X. Number of slices is the thing he can control. Number of burps is the result or the outcome of that. Cool? So that's your video on independent and dependent variables.